Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Pete Tigis. I'm not sure if you've been the same, but the long winter layoff has meant I've been a little rusty. I've spent time shaking off the shack nasties and cobwebs with my pal Perry doing some casting so that when we open for trout, I'll still be able to figure out which way up to hold the rod. My guest today is a deep-thinking angler who always has a lot of interesting advice on fishing techniques, and as always, I'm looking forward to learning something new from him. I'm pleased to be joined again by Dr. Paul Gaskell. Paul, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Are you good?
I am very well, actually, these days. I had an interesting bout of about 5 different varieties of flu and COVID and things over Christmas and that, but I think that's pretty universal experience for a lot of people this winter. But yeah, I'm very well.
Good. And what have you been up to then? Have you been able to do some stuff aside from the illnesses?
Yeah. between Lemsips, I've actually been pretty busy. I've got a ton of stuff going on, sort of side projects and this kind of thing. But in terms of fishing, I've managed to get out for the grayling a few times. Had some particularly good success around the sort of the post-trout spawning period with the kind of, hot orange bead sort of flies for obvious reasons. And that's been very nice. And also writing up some stuff and getting on top of some projects that I've been, putting off for a while, including a brand new writing project, which I think we'll possibly get into a little bit later on. But some of that at least features our mutual friend Luke Kozak. So we can touch on that. And yes, actually having my website revamped as well, and working with another mutual friend, which is, I guess, it's testament to the network of the angling fraternity. But Kieran has been helping me out a bit with some new website ideas and things. So good mixture of kind of, I guess, business and pleasure over the winter.
It's fascinating because I talk about creative people a lot here and on Facebook and all sorts of other places, but you come into that from a slightly different angle. Of course, you're a writer, but you're an incredibly creative person anyway, aren't you?
Well, that's maybe blush a little bit, but I think, even when I was kind of like a proper scientist for a while there in academia, I think particularly within biology, there's quite a lot of room for creativity and also that kind of autodidactism. You have to kind of teach yourself new skills if you want to explore different ideas and new avenues. And I think that definitely played into, moving into trying to do some publishing in various formats and, learning desktop publishing and, learning video creation, videography, how the YouTube algorithm works. So I think all of these avenues that allow you to kind of communicate your ideas, there's a whole suite of different skills that you have to kind of learn and teach yourself in order to do that. So you kind of maybe spend a lifetime learning about the fishing side of things, and then to sort of communicate those ideas, you end up doing all these crazy other things as well. And actually, I find that really refreshing, and it keeps my interest really high. It's something I seem to thrive on. So it's a wonderful time to be living in as well, because we have all these tools that, maybe weren't accessible to, the general members of the public. And, unless you owned a TV studio or, you owned, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of camera equipment or editing gear and whatever else, it just wasn't available to you. But even within the last 10 to 15 years, the availability of stuff that keen consumers can actually get hold of it is incredible, and it does give rise to a huge amount of creative opportunities, I think.
And for me, you have a foot in both those camps, because I wouldn't always think that science and creativity go that closely hand in hand, because science, I guess, is based on facts and creativity is gut. So it must be nice to have a flow from both sides.
It is, and I suppose for me, the interesting and the compelling thing about science, and particularly in biology, yes, there's a lot of that kind of painstaking grind to kind of piece together and test your ideas, but the most interesting findings tend to come out of the, how original are your hypotheses, what are the ideas and the creative kind of angles you can look at particular situations with. And the creativity is in having the ideas of what you're going to test and how you're going to maybe try and understand things. So there's quite a nice interplay between that, admittedly, drudgery. let's face it, of gathering enough sort of data points to kind of make sensible comments about a particular system. But there is a surprising amount of creativity within that, and also, I certainly benefited from before I was in science professionally. I really didn't like public speaking very much, and I probably wasn't very good at it. In fact, I certainly wasn't very good at it. But by being forced into sort of having to communicate and clarify those ideas, I've kind of come to enjoy that and engaging with bigger audiences in various formats. But I do particularly enjoy, being in contact with a live audience and having that interaction. So yeah, it's interesting you should say that there is that a surprising amount of creativity, I would say, in science. And I guess with my personality, I try and bring a lot of that to my fishing as well.
And do you think that comes from a PhD academia background of writing papers? Because obviously you've written for ourselves and many other people and alongside all the books. Does that mean that the writing process comes more easily to you in that way?
I think it does. And I think that really helped when I sort of started blogging, the fact that I already had that muscle quite well exercised. I think the great thing about writing is it forces you to think clearly about your ideas and how you can express them in the simplest way possible. So, in fact, if you do your job well as a writer, particularly when you're talking about technical aspects, if you say something and people say, "Oh, well, that's bloody obvious," when after you've explained it, I think that's a good acid test of when you've done your job well, because it means that you've arrived at some simple explanation on the far side of some maybe complicated thinking. So it's a cliche, but it's simplicity on the far side of complexity, and I think writing really forces you into doing that, particularly if you're doing it regularly. And it seems to get easier that the more you do it, the fewer drafts it takes, and the quicker you can get to something that is kind of usable, which is very important with content creation online these days, because the pace of that is just incredible.
Do you find then that the creative writing or the more factual writing, which is of more interest to you?
Good question. I think I enjoy creative writing more. In some ways it's harder because to be creative but to not be derivative and to actually have an authentic voice is quite, that's quite something. And I really admire writers that do that consistently. But I do enjoy because any of the technical writing that I do, those technical ideas is always in pursuit of a better experience on stream. And so it's the experience that's really the valuable thing. It's not the numbers or the kind of the accolades or whatever, that very sort of shallow side of things. It's more, I'm trying to give myself and other people more opportunities for those memorable days on stream. And what's more valuable than that, the spending time on stream and having those, fantastic experiences that we all know what that feels like. And I think trying to capture that feeling that's the kind of writing that I enjoy the most.
It's interesting that you mention about that feeling of being out on those memorable days, because it feels to me that, and I've touched on it a little bit in previous podcasts as well, but I'm getting a sense that we are shifting as fly anglers and looking at the bigger picture more so than perhaps we may have done before. Do you detect that too?
I think it's almost inevitable because there's so many things going on, societally and certainly politically, that's really focusing our minds on that precious resource, which is, the wild fisheries that we rely on and the spaces that we rely on. It's kind of been forced in our faces a little bit. And I guess, being a Gen Xer, we kind of, I guess, grew up in a bit of a relatively carefree time, I suppose, if you count the post-Cold War sort of era, where things were generally abundant and opportunities to enjoy nature. Water quality improved significantly from the dieback of industry in the 80s onwards. So we kind of enjoyed a little bit of a golden age. But I suppose that being said, compared to the pre-war era and the sort of the levels of hatches that anglers would have enjoyed, and the fishing that anglers would have enjoyed at that time, that's outside of our generational memory. And I think that was, significantly more abundant and, prior to that heavy industrialization of our rural spaces in the UK, particularly. So I think, the way that things are at the moment, it's really forcing us to pay attention to the environment and the resource that we rely on for, the thing that is very important to us in our lives as anglers. And of course, water quality and the treatment of our waterways is very, very prominent now, which is great because it's something that, within my professional life, I've been aware of that for a long time, but it's just, the last several years, it's more, much more appreciated by the wider public as well as the angling community. So, and I guess within that, I obviously accept that that's a hugely important aspect is that the treatment of water quality and what value we place on it. But I always look at rivers as like a three-legged milking stool. So alongside water quality, you've also got the habitat quality and the connectivity of those good quality habitats, as well as the amount of water as well. So it doesn't matter which one of those three legs is missing, or, heaven forbid, if there's more than one of those missing, our rivers are going to be in trouble. So I'm very keen to support, the message about improving water quality. I also don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater and forget about habitat quality and the access to that habitat, and also adequate flows. And obviously all these things are playing into, the climatic changes that we're seeing as well. So we've got a lot on our plates, and it is, I guess, particularly for, boomers, Gen Xers, that legacy of the environment that we're leaving to future generations. I think that exercise of maybe trying to write a letter to future generations and explaining, how and why the environment was left in the way that it has been, I think that is quite a powerful thing to do. And we certainly have responsibility. It may not always feel like we have the most power and agency to do things about that, but I think if enough people come together and demand it and make it more of a political imperative and a voting issue, then that is the way that we will see change in the future. So it takes enough people to want something. So it's super important to keep communicating that, we need to keep raising the issues and keep fighting the fight for, better environments and protecting what we still have as well.
That was beautifully put, and some really interesting points there, because I think we can easily be bogged down in a particular issue, can't we, and focus on that when they're, like you rightly and correctly said, about the habitat as well as the water quality, as well as farming issues, other issues. You can get fixated, and that's social media for me is a wonderful way to allow people to be able to hear about something, but the song or the tune needs to change a little bit sometimes to let people know that there are other factors involved as well that we should also be focusing on. It would that be fair comment?
I think so, and I think within that as well, it's really important to spread the understanding that it's not an either or in terms of the economy and society, and then the environments are nice to have after that. Without a fully functioning environment, that there is no economy. Ultimately, because you can't eat money, as they say, and that kind of thing. And if ecosystems aren't working properly, then they're not doing things that we all need, like produce oxygen, for example. So it's much more shifting that idea that it's an either or in terms of like a strong economy or good environmental conditions. If they don't go hand in hand, then you're screwed anyway, and there's no point having an economy. So,
and from a conservational standpoint as well, do you think there should be or could be or there is a little bit more of a link up between these other interested parties in water quality? And the reason I mention that is that I saw the news 2-3 months ago, and the surfers were picketing one of the water companies down here, I knew nothing about it. And I'd love to have gone along and tried to organise. Do you detect there's more of that happening, or do you think more of that should be happening?
I think it's potentially very powerful, and I think certainly a big part of the reason that the sewage in rivers is, a much more widely appreciated topic at the moment in the media, as well as just in the angling community and the wider public. It's not only the anglers, and there's obviously been some very important, very vocal advocates for that, but it's people like wild swimmers as well, that it's very easy for anybody, even if they've never held a fishing rod, they can understand that people don't want to be gulping down other people's poo when they're swimming in rivers. That seems like a fairly basic sort of concept, and I think that's very important. At the same time, it's on us and people who have good degrees of technical understanding to make sure that various pressure groups are really well informed, so that we can have proper debates, and also sort of pushing the right messages and coming up with viable solutions as well, and then engaging with that. So it's super, super easy to point at all things that are wrong, and be absolutely correct, but without putting forward and engaging with, well, what are the solutions? What do we really want as a society? What are we prepared to pay for as a society? All of that noise is for naught, because, we need to also be pushing solutions, as well as kind of, yes, we need to kind of clash the pitchforks and sort of, actually, raise the issue. But we'd be missing a massive opportunity if we don't also bring to the table viable, well thought through solutions that have appropriate expert advice behind them.
And that's where people like yourself, because I'm a foot stomper and hands-on teapotter and everything else, and I try and do everything that I can, but I'm not as smart as somebody like yourself, and I look to take my lead from what people like yourself are saying and the work that you're doing with the Wild Trout Trust as well, that I listen to, and I can use that, and that filtering down from you guys and, of course, other organisations as well is incredibly important to me, and I'm sure many others as well. But I'd like to move on a little bit, because you touched on how technology has moved on so dramatically in such a short time, and you used that wonderful word, blogs. And as a blogger, and as a former blogger myself, I guess, as well, that I really enjoyed that as an output for me creatively as well. And as somebody who writes technical books, how does that process begin for you then? Does that mean that you will keep notes from things that you've noticed or discovered on a day on the water? Is that where that starts for you? Is it from, I thought I've noticed something there might be something here I want to investigate a little bit more deeply? Is that where you go with this?
I kind of, and I think when I'm being super diligent, I will write things down, and I think that is the best way to go about it. Now that might not be kind of facts and figures and very, very sort of technical notation. It's more remembering what happened and the experience of that, and what the pertinent conditions were. What was the scenario? What were the patterns that seemed to emerge on a particular day? I don't always manage to do that, but I've usually at least got a camera with me, so that I can come back home, and it's a nice activity actually to kind of unpack a day's fishing and look through the photographs, keep the good ones, maybe process a few, and during that time, what I might then do is jot down a few notes. But oftentimes when it comes to books, it tends to be the accretion over time of like repeat things that I keep bashing my head into kind of accidentally. These things keep coming up time and time again, and eventually it becomes kind of irritating enough that, okay, there's probably an idea within this, and I probably have to write it down and explore it a bit more. So it's more the things that kind of come up repeatedly and consistently that I guess those things are trying to give me a hint that they might be important. And it tends to be these kind of high level patterns and principles I guess, really. That's what I love kind of exploring, because I've got quite a short attention span in some respects. And so when it comes to just learning like lists of facts, the way that my brain works, it doesn't deal with that very well. But if I can learn an idea that allows me to kind of derive the facts that I need under a wide range of circumstances, I absolutely love that, because it saves my lazy brain a lot of work from just kind of, it'd be the equivalent of like having to learn vocab for, a language exam or something like that. I much more enjoy the process of how like the language of fishing works and the sort of the mechanism behind things. Because if you know the mechanism, then you can fill in the gaps with the little facts and things that you need afterwards. So, yeah, to answer the question, it is more these ideas that seem to surface gradually over time. I'll test them out and try to sort of break them, pull them apart. Things that stand up to scrutiny, that's what sort of makes it into the book. But that process does take quite a long time. And, the ideas that start 10, 5, 7 years earlier eventually end up in a book, which has a value, because obviously it's kind of, there's a robustness to that, and it's something that's proven true over time. But it does mean that sometimes some of the things that I'm enjoying success from takes a long time to kind of get out into the public. And I guess, I mean, it's a horribly heavy-handed plug, but that is the genuine reason that I started the newer project that I've got, which is basically publishing things and ideas and stuff that I'm testing, whether that's ideas, experiences, stories, or techniques. At the time, within the month that I'm doing that, and a select bunch of my email subscribers pay a very nominal fee to kind of have the inside track on what I'm up to during that month. So that was really a way for me to kind of make a complete circle from the ideas that eventually filter down into books. And I think I've published 7 books now, which is crazy, I think, over the last 10 years. But again, a lot of those ideas have filtered through from the previous, 30, 40 years of fishing. So yeah, being able to do things live as well, it allows me to kind of cover both of those bases. People can get access to that before having to wait for it to be kind of formalized and like set in stone in print, if you like.
What you've done for me as well is display perfectly how you have a foot in each camp, and your process that is driven by something, yet you need to collect the data to have the concept for the book as well. So it's a lovely insight into it, because I was thinking yesterday, I was fishing for salmon. I knew I wasn't going to catch anything. I wrote something, and it was just words that captured what I felt at that moment in time. So that's the creative bit from where I am. But you also have the double whammy, the wonderful scientific side of things. So it's lovely to get a sense of where you are and how you feel about that. And congratulations on so many books. And you plug away as well, because they're really, really good. And people listening, if they haven't, should sign up. They should look at those books as well, because I believe books that are written by people like yourself and others as well, who I've had on the podcast, that have looked at fact. And so it's really hard to dispute that. So we know what your thought process has been for these and how that's translated into the book, that it's based on something. And a lot of what I'm doing is, well, they liked it here today, or they liked that, and that's gut. And sometimes that's right, that can be, but not every day. But what I love to learn from is those facts from people like yourself. And that must be really interesting for you, putting this together as well, and then saying, actually, yes, what I've been thinking about has led to something that leads to either an email or a chapter of a book. That must be a very pleasing moment for you, I guess.
It is, and it's a very similar satisfaction to if you create something with your hands, whether it's tying a fly, doing a painting or something. It's something that you kind of thought, thoughts become things, that the idea that you take an idea, test it out and mold it into something, and then hopefully share it with people that find value in it. And of course, there's plenty of people that absolutely hate my stuff, but that's the way it should be. This is kind of one person's perspective on it, but hopefully there seems to be, a good proportion of people that share similar enjoyments of the kind of aspects of angling that I get joy from. So for obviously the books are written for those people, and there's plenty of other stuff for the people that maybe don't enjoy that approach to things. And it is interesting because, again, we're coming back to almost that kind of symmetry with the way that I kind of interacted with science in terms of angling, or my angling life, in that you've got that, I do have a favourite saying, which is that, I'll take one tested and accurately, one accurately measured result over 1,000 opinions. And in some ways, that's very, very useful in angling because, there's no shortage of opinions wherever you look on social media or any sort of published media. But at the same time, you can cut through a lot of that, and the sort of the kernel of the scientist within inside me, I suppose, the whole point of science is to try and avoid being fooled by randomness, because randomness creates wonderful patterns. And as humans, we're very, very adept at recognizing patterns, whether it's, faces in clouds or, religious icons in potato waffles or whatever the thing happens to be. But being fooled by that randomness, that there's so much opportunity for that within fishing, that sometimes taking that step back and saying, well, actually, if I try and disprove this, and that's all good science is, it's the only belief system that tries to disprove itself. So if you try and break something and try and make it not work, and then you're able to recreate the way that something works, you've got a reasonably good basis for saying, yeah, I think this is probably important, and this maybe is the way that things work. But finding those tests is creative, and then the actual enjoyment that you get out of practicing your craft well, that's very, very non-scientific, and it's very not that sort of dry and sanguine approach to things. It's much more that romantic and poetic enjoyment of the activity. And the more that you see of, recognize these true patterns within nature, the more rich that tapestry becomes. And for me, the more beautiful it is. So it's almost like a license to appreciate and enjoy nature more fully, rather than to try and reduce it down to something that is engineering and cold and sterile, which is a risk if you try to go, I think, too technical and get too bogged down in facts and figures and that kind of thing. It's a tool to try and understand and enjoy things more. And like any tool, you can choose to hold it by the handle or the blade. So, and people... Excuse me. I've still got a lingering 100-day cough going on down in the. But there's plenty of examples of people using tools by the handle and holding the blade end and sort of making a right mess of it. So.
I think that was absolutely beautifully put, and it segues nicely going into the poetic, beautiful side of things. And wanted to move on to fishing because I know listeners and myself would love to know what your thoughts are. And let's take a situation that it's early season. What does that mean to you from a fishing perspective? How are you looking at things when you first arrive at the river, perhaps for the first day?
Well, for me, early season starts before the first day, but there's that fantastic anticipation that we have for the first dry fly fishing opportunities of the year and that kind of thing. And I think that is a wonderful aspect. And it's certainly, the anticipation is a huge part of that. For me right now, it's kind of filling me with slight anxiety because there's so many holes and gaps in my my fly boxes. I'm going to need to sit down and do a big stint of tying to replace my, tried and trusted patterns. But arriving at the river for that first session of the season, it's wonderful because oftentimes it's that time of year when the fish are keen to kind of pack on some weight after winter, and you've always got that opportunity of an early season hatch and some surface activity, and that it will be a timeless part of fly fishing. That enjoyment of the surface take is something that capture so many people, to the extent that many people, if they can't catch a trout on a dry fly, maybe they prefer to not catch it at all, which I can totally understand. That as an approach. But yeah, arriving on stream, obviously I have a kind of a canon of fundamental tactics to sort of fall back on, and they would fall into dry fly, probably upstream wet fly, nymphing of various sort of flavors, and I guess those would be the three sort of main early season tactics. And in terms of applying them, and we can talk about, if you like, about sort of basic setups and the sorts of things that might appear on the leader and that kind of thing. Well, let's do that first. But then I want to keep in mind the sort of, that's level one. It's rung one on the ladder, is having confidence in the stuff that you've got. And I'm very fond of the idea that a true maestro, a true expert in any discipline, whether it's fly fishing or whatever, they're the people that can do the fundamentals flawlessly. So it's not about who's got the most, stupid people like to make things really complex. I think that's something worth keeping in mind. So people that are truly fantastic at things, they have the fundamentals down so flawlessly that it gives them a ton of headspace to kind of experiment with other things. And it frees up that creative ability because you've got the basics down so well that it doesn't take up any bandwidth at all whilst you're fishing. So in terms of dry fly, I split my time between, I guess I would say, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Standard isn't quite the right word, but let's say conventional dry fly fishing, which would be a fly line of some kind, relatively long leader. I'm happy enough to use factory tapered leaders. I might chop back a bit of the thickest part of it and get the sort of taper that I want. But, that might be somewhere between 15 and 18 feet long, maybe, leader. When I'm using fly line, I like to separate the splashdown of that line from the touchdown of the fly. And there's things you can do to enhance that. So getting further down the sort of the development, if you like, the skills development, the idea, and it's quite prominent in one of the schools of Italian fly casting, the idea that the fly lands first. So actually casting the dry fly so it hits the water, and you get a couple of moments of hang time before that line actually touches down. And oftentimes, if you've placed the fly well, the little splat of the dry fly landing is enough for the fish to turn on your fly and take it. If you have that fly line landing down, and I don't care if it's like a 2-weight fly line, you have a look at a flat pool with a line landing on it next time you get a chance to cast, and it's a significant disturbance. That separation is what I find is important, and why I use maybe a longer leader. I don't often go beyond like 20 feet because the kind of rivers that I fish in wouldn't really demand that. But there is a need, in my eyes at least, for some consideration of separating the line splashdown from the fly landing. And obviously, early season, my part of the world, one of the first significant hatches is large dark olives. So olive emergers, looking for those lazier, more considered rises where the fish are taking their time a little bit, then I'm going to be looking towards an emerger. If they're a bit splashy and if there's duns fluttering around, then I might be, looking more to a sort of a higher floating dun pattern. Certainly in the earlier stages of the hatches. And some days there can be a mixture. Different cohorts of fish might be particularly keen on one or other aspect of it. I would say it's relatively unusual for a fish to refuse an emerger. There are times when the dun will outperform it, but if I'm not sure what they're taking, I'll usually start with an emerger, because being glued into that surface film, it's a surefire meal for the fish, and they certainly recognise that as a prey image. So that would be and basically looking for risers, targeting them, and hopefully having some success with it. That being said, depending on how cold the winter's been, and this is the biologist in me talking, sometimes you can get very, very good early season hatches and the fish are still asleep. And that can continue for a couple of weeks, depending on what part of the world you're in. It seems to me that insects have much smaller bodies, so they will be able to kind of warm up more quickly. Flight muscles get working more quickly. They can hatch out, swarm together, mate, and get the next generation of eggs laid. And sometimes that can happen early season without any attention from the fish, even though that available food source is there for them. It seems like it's more of a gamble to sort of break the enforced lockdown hibernation sort of mode where fish have been absolutely shut down and just ticking over with very, very low metabolic rate. And I can kind of get that from an economist point of view. If you're thinking of calories as currency, calories in and calories out. If you start your season too early as a trout and then all of a sudden you have another cold snap and there's no food around, then you've gone through all of that, effort of firing up all of those metabolic systems, only for it to be starved of fuel, and that's quite a risky situation to be in, and they could find themselves in starvation pretty quickly. So that's why I think sometimes the fish take longer to latch onto those early season hatches until they're very reliable, and it's all go. All that being said, in my part of the world, we've had a very mild winter for the latter part of it, apart from a couple of notable cold snaps. So my expectation is that olives will have been trickling off fairly steadily for quite a substantial period over the winter, which means we probably won't get enormous flush hatches of them when the spring proper finally arrives. But what it does probably mean is that I think the trout will be pretty active from day one on the trout season, which is the 24th of March in my part of the world. I know it starts in different places across the country. But yeah, that's kind of the opportunity for that dry fly experience and the way I sort of go about that. Sometimes you might arrive on the river and big obvious hatches is not either it's not in progress or it's not the right time of day. At that point, I'm looking at sort of fishing deeper, using nymphs, slowing down the presentation, still including some of those induced take movements, because they're switching from that winter sort of grubbing around mode of just kind of taking very sedentary prey to things that are apt to kind of zoom towards the surface and try and escape and hatch out. So I'm definitely incorporating movement into my nymphing early season. And then there's that transition between those two extremes where it's not quite, the hatch isn't in full swing and the rise isn't in full swing, but they're kind of turning their attention from the riverbed to sort of mid-upper water column. And upstream wet fly can be a fantastic way of sort of hedging your bets, if you like. So you might have a beadhead nymph on the point and something like a water hen blower on the dropper or whatever the local sort of specialty might be for your dropper fly in that respect. And I think people get quite nervous about upstream wet fly in terms of it, take detection and finding it difficult. But if you've got a solid grounding in nymphing tactics, then it's really the same ball game that you're playing. So those are the three things that I like to look forward to. And, I hesitate to mention sort of geofishing because, it's particularly on small streams, it's very much a staple. Works really well on larger rivers too. But I find myself more and more in a situation where the duo or the hopper-dropper, depending on what part of the world you're in, there's a better, more refined presentation for what the fish happen to be doing. Now, I don't say that to denigrate it because I find it a fantastically useful method to teach people about reading the water, and it can be absolutely the correct method to use at a given time. And then another great value of it is that it teaches you that kind of delivery where you're holding the rod tip back and letting everything land in the water and then holding as much line, lead or whatever off the water right up to that dry fly. That translates really well into high-level nymphing tactics and high-level upstream wet fly tactics. I think far too many people, in my opinion, tend to fish a hopper-dropper or a duo like it's float fishing, and they'll cast a lot of fly line onto the water and then they'll suspend a nymph under it. For me, the best way to use that dry dropper duo rig is as a very fast coverage method where the fly is either drifting or sinking, but it's never really suspended by the dry fly itself. And to do that, you are firing from the hip and you're holding everything off the water right up to the eye of that dry fly. And getting that muscle memory, that really helps, I find, with some of the more tactical nymphing approaches. It's very good for transferring across into tenkara, for example, to learn that proper tenkara cast. And any tenkara haters out there, I will submit that good tenkara casting is far more difficult than regular fly line casting, but we can have that discussion separately. But that idea of holding the rod tip back and having everything land in perfect fishing formation as soon as it hits the water, and you're ready to track the drift as soon as it lands, those are all fantastic fundamentals to be on top of. So I think, duo is definitely very, very valuable from those aspects. All that being said, I very, very rarely fish it these days because I'm normally trying to work on some other presentation aspect. And so I think it's important, as I say, to have these fundamentals, but then use them as kind of springboards to experiment with other things. And the big thing for me is understanding the principle behind it, because if you do that, you can take the effect that you're trying to achieve with any given rig, whether it's duo or whatever, and then you can work backwards to bespoke design your own system that's going to best support that presentation that you want. So if you have a very keen understanding what the presentation is that you want to achieve, you can then work back and design a delivery system, which is a combination of your casting skills and the rig that you use to sort of actually create that. That becomes quite powerful then, because you're really thinking in 3 dimensions, and you sort of you're taking a much more fish-centric approach to it, rather than what do the books say I'm supposed to be using in terms of rigs and measurements and flies at this time of year. Because, particularly with a changing climate, they don't often read the hatch charts, and they don't often read what they should be doing at any given month of the year. So you've got to be prepared to kind of adapt and try and understand what's happening in the natural world and exploit that with the rigs and the tactics that you use. And then that gets sort of quite, esoteric and quite high level, or as complicated as you want to make it, basically. But it all stems from having sound fundamentals.
It's a wealth of information there, Paul. Thank you so much. I'm sure that's going to get people thinking. There's lots I wanted to ask you, but one of the first things I think really is when it comes to the techniques that you've talked about, and there's a lot of information there that you've given. Funnily enough, one of the points I was going to talk about was the duo. Do you think people use it as a nymph with an indicator really, rather than perhaps how we first thought about it? But these techniques that you've talked about, and having a spider on the dropper, for example, the outright dry, the duo, etc., how quickly will you adapt and change those methods as the fishing unfolds in front of you? Will that be as the clues unfold as well? Or are you consistently thinking, right, perhaps I should be changing?
I think depending on how good of a feel I've got for a particular river in terms of how often do they give up their fish, how far do I have to walk between fish on this particular river, because on some waters, you're going to have to cover some water between each fish because the population density is lower. Maybe the fish are bigger as well, so there's kind of a trade-off there. But assuming I've got a reasonable feel for what the river could be providing under a set of conditions, I'll change very, very quickly these days. And it wasn't always the case, but it's just that I've now run through enough scenarios that you kind of know, well, that drift through there should have produced a fish, so something's not quite right, so I'll change it. And trying to cultivate that mindset of delivering every cast with the intent that you're going to catch a fish, expect to catch a fish on every cast, even though that's usually unrealistic. It means that you're making every offer, and certainly the first offer that you make to every fish is your best one. That makes a huge difference in terms of being able to do it well and to see the results, or the result that you're trying to achieve in that particular situation. So It ties in quite neatly, actually, to something that I did want to talk about, which is particularly early season on particular rivers, or any river if you can find one. But I have some in mind for the particular waters that I fish a lot. I always like to have what I call a kind of a calendar or a calendar calibration pool. And that sounds odd, but what I mean by that is I want to find that pool where it represents all of the different types of water that you would find fish in across a whole 12 months. So it'll have some really deep, slow water that they hang out in winter. It'll have some pacier glides that, as they kind of move up and get the idea about maybe looking towards more active prey. And then, it'll go all the way through that continuum up to that ramp at the front end, which will be the shallow, riffly water, maybe some pockets in it, ideally. And sort of everything along that continuum, because if you can work out what's going on in that calibration pool, then you've teed into an idea that you've got a pretty good chance that you go and find similar types of water, little packets and parcels of water that you found to be successful within that calibration pool. You can walk the rest of your river and find isolated examples of that and target those, rather than fishing all of the water in front of you for the whole session. And it gives you, I love that as a barometer, because particularly if you fish a local water regularly, that calendar pool is a fantastic acid test for where the fish are in their season, which often bears no resemblance to what we think they should be doing. But it's a very, very good, it's an example of one of those, measured results rather than opinions, in terms of what are the fish actually doing this time of year right now? What sort of food sources are they keying into? What types of water are they going to be sitting in? And, that you can track that early season, you can track them coming out of that deep water, moving up, becoming more active, heading towards the shallower water. Then when you're getting finally, into June and you've got warm temperatures and they're loving that kind of very active sort of well-oxygenated riffly water. And to be fair, as well as as much as I love the early season fishing, that kind of early period of like late May, early June, where they're in the shallow water and you can sort of get up close and personal with the fish that you're targeting. I absolutely love that kind of pocket water style fishing. And that's certainly something that, I have an anticipation for. And that calibration pool, that allows you to know when that is on the cards for your session, when they've moved into that mode of feeding and where you're likely to find them in the rest of your river.
Great advice, Nick, because it's very easy, isn't it, that you've got a day's fishing that you get in the river and fish the river. And I've often said playing the averages, and I guess that's what you're saying, isn't it, with your calibration pool and figuring out that's the one, right, this is where I've been picking up fish. Because it's easy even that I've caught one there, and I'm even guilty of it sometimes. You can't even remember what you've done by the time you've released the fish and on a little bit of a high as a result of it. But you're taking that information in and then that's setting where you're going to fish. So I think that's some wonderful advice. I was thinking, I just wanted to circle back a little bit because you were talking about duo and fishing it on a very short line. And you talked about length of leaders for dry flies as well. What sort of casting distances are you talking about from a dry fly perspective as well? Because I know the management of slightly longer leaders for some with a shorter man line may pose its problems. But I wanted to get a sense for people that what sort of distances are you talking about when you're saying, right, I'm fishing an 18-foot leader or a 20-foot leader? Does that also mean that you're staying well back from the fish rather than getting a little bit closer? I just was looking for a little bit of context of that as well, please.
Yeah. And I would say when I'm fishing fly line techniques, so I'm again, these conventional Western fly line sort of style of dry fly fishing, that generally means I'm needing to fish at a greater range. Now, I mean, I come originally, believe it or not, from a reservoir stillwater background. So I'm not talking about double hauling to the horizon. I'm probably talking about 1 to 2 rod lengths of fly line out of the tip, and always being as close to the fish as I can without spooking them. So the first tenet is first spook, no fish. once you've got that nailed down, then I'm as close as possible without doing that. That being said, if I'm going to fish, if I can get close to fish, rather than that conventional approach that I talk about, I'll very often fish a traditional, so an old school style French leader. So more of the original casting taper of leaders that folks like Pascal Cognard would have used back in the day and probably still does. And for that style of dry fly fishing, I'll have everything off the water, and I will use that the style of leader, and I like to describe it as it having authority over the fly, because it actually creates a proper fly casting loop, and you can fly cast genuinely a dry fly on a French leader with no fly line out of the tip ring. That allows me to hold everything off the water and deliver just the fly onto it, and that's overlapping quite a lot with the sorts of presentations you get with wet flies on traditional tenkara. And that's also where that tenkara casting stroke comes in very useful, because it allows you to deliver that dry fly very accurately. So when I'm fishing as close as, if, for example, if there's any broken water that allows me to hide between, if I can place that riffly broken water between myself and the fish, you can stand pretty much on top of trout and cast to them with that kind of triangular sort of formation where your rod is forming one half of one side of an equilateral triangle, and the leader is forming the other half of that in elevation if you're viewing it from the side. That leaves the water between your feet and the fish completely undisturbed, and it also means you're not having to manage drag to the same degree. It's very effective, and it's also quite satisfying and hypnotic when you're able to get that casting loop right as well. It's very much not just kind of dapping and dangling the fly in the water. You're actually having to kind of snappily deliver that with a really nice unrolling casting loop with that leader. And so the types of leaders I tend to use for that are the tapers that John Pearson came up with, and they're now sold by Fish On if people want to buy them. There's recipes in the books, again, so plugging away. If you want to roll your own, if you like, there's all the details in that, along with some video guidance to do that. But yeah, if you want to just hit the water and fish, Fish On Productions do sell them. I have no affiliation financially with them at all, but those are the patterns of leaders that I use. And that works really well for short-range dry fly fishing. And I urge people that haven't tried it to give it a go, because it's a bit of a initial speed bump in your learning curve. But once you get that casting stroke and you can deliver it, it means you can drop your dry fly into the top of a pint pot, sized feature, and then have it drift perfectly. So you can aim for the pin, you can aim right, exactly where you want that fish to be looking at your fly and taking it.
What a great tip. And that's got me thinking about, we talked about, and I guess part of this is the guide in you as well, about changing quickly, because I'm thinking about where I fish, and I know you know the tour a little bit, but I'm thinking of a situation where I might want to change things up so that perhaps I'm fishing more conventionally, and then there might be a situation. Does that mean that you will keep something, either a spare spool, and I mean a fishing spool rather than a spool of line, but there may be a spool with one of those leaders set up so that you're ready and you'll take the time to quickly make that adjustment when you see that's necessary?
So I'm going to take two paths to answer that. One would be with, I guess, my guides and my coaching hat on, and one would be from my personal point of view. So from the personal perspective, I'll often find that I would like to try to pick an approach and work with that because I found it satisfying. So I'll probably do myself out of fish by doing that, but what I want to find is the satisfaction of a little refinement that helps me make something work. And that means that I would be much less likely to kind of chop and change fundamentally, apart from flies and maybe the length of, the rig I'm using. But I wouldn't wholesale change from one style of fishing to another. I would kind of find the opportunities where I think that style will work and then try and see if I can, match that prediction. In terms of coaching people and getting people to have those positive reinforcement experiences that allow them to get to the point where they can decide to change quickly because they know that should have worked, And you can't do that without catching enough fish where they've told you that was the right thing to be doing. If I'm doing that, what I like to do is carry what's called shikaki maki, which are the particular design of spool line holders that they use in Japan for a whole range of fishing, including tenkara, which seems to be cropping up a lot in this conversation, but it's what I use. And the design of those means that there's kind of a plastic spool, or whatever material the spool is, and then there's a foam arbor that allows you to there's a notch you can hook your point fly into, but if you've got dropper flies on there, you can knock those into the foam arbor, and then when you get to the end of that rig, there's the plastic sort of almost petals that press up against the outside edge of that foam arbor, which allows you to snug the loose butt end down, and that traps it and holds it in place. So forgive the long-winded explanation, but the reason for it is that you can whip on a fly in an entire rig, and that's tippet and whatever casting leader you might have, and whatever you've got on your rig beyond the fly line will live happily on one of those spools. And you can wrap it up in seconds, have it in a pocket or have it on a lanyard or whatever you want to do with it. I tend to just shove mine in a pocket, to be honest. And then you can strip everything off a separate rig and then be chopped and changed within a few seconds. And I like to use the attachment I use most commonly as an extension of the ladder leader idea that, again, is in the Nymphing Bible book, where I girth hitch the butt end of my rigs onto a stopper knot rather than... I don't particularly like having loops at the end of things if I can help it. So more often than not, I'm attaching something to the end of a traditional French leader. So I might, for instance, put a Spanish leader, a very, very fine, micro-thin level, maybe 0.16 millimeter diameter level nylon that might be 6, 7, 8 meters long, or whatever it is for the particular river I'm fishing. But I'll attach that to the tip end of my traditional French leader. And then because I use little bunny ears on the loop that I use on the girth hitch, I can pull those off so they come off instantly. Don't have to fanny around with like loop to loop and trying to feed rigs through a small loop. It just jumps off and it also hitches on nearly instantly. That allows me to chop and change what sits on the end of my regular French leader, whether that's a section of indicator tippet, whether it's direct to tippet, or whether it's something like a Spanish leader that I've extended that system with, and then I'll wind it all onto the reel to the point that I want to use it. So shikaki maki with your rigs on, girth hitch with bunny ears on. That's the you heard it here, folks. That's your free guiding tip if you want to be out and swapping your clients over and trying to keep up with what the fish are doing, because oftentimes they'll change what they're doing far more quickly than you can, tie 4 or 5 knots and attach, a bunch of different flies and different rigs. So yeah, very, very instant way to change, and it allows you to stay on top of things. Good for competitions as well if people are into that sort of thing.
Some more wonderful advice. We're coming up an hour now, Paul, and it's absolutely flown by. But I know we were talking off mic and you used the term thoughtful. How would you sum that up for people as a segue onto the very last section?
So I think what I'm getting at there is, like, we've talked about getting those fundamentals down really well and then having enough positive reinforcements from the fish to give you absolute confidence that those, you're doing those techniques correctly and you're using them well. When you get to that point, it allows you much more scope to approach a piece of water and then read it much more like a very, very good musician would look at a piece of sheet music. So they no longer see the notation on that sheet music. They don't have to consciously think, oh, that means a G and this is... They just feel and hear the music when they look at that. By doing that and building up those fundamentals, that's the headspace and the bandwidth that it gives you. When you look at a piece of water, you think, I need to be standing in that spot, and this is the delivery system and the tactics that will perfectly present that fly to the fish, to what they're doing at that period of time. So that thoughtful aspect it allows you to cherry pick different elements from the standard ways of doing things. So you can combine several different methods, labeled methods, and then come up with a kind of a hybrid of those that work for you on that day. That's a thought process. And then the other thing that I like to do is just try to avoid, and again, it's the biologist in me speaking, but this idea of habituation where fish, if they see a particular stimulus or signal that is either doesn't give them a positive experience, or even more so, if it results in a negative experience, they start to turn down and attenuate that feeding response to it. So a good example of that might be the use of gold beads on flies. You know, when they first came out, they were it's like fish had no answer to them, no resilience to them at all. They were just absolutely devastating on pretty much any fly you put them on, and partly because of the way it made the fly sink, and partly because it helped it stand out a little bit, I guess, from the crowd. But on a lot of the waters that I fish on now, if you put a gold bead version of a beadhead nymph on, it's going to spook fish rather than actually catch them. So just think about how, particularly on waters where there's lots of other anglers that fish get to see lots of flies, how can I make my fly slightly different? How can I hit the same sort of trigger points, but make my sort of version of it unique, and avoid that sort of attenuation and that habituation from the fish? And that can get you a huge amount of additional, again, potentially red letter days and that one special fish that might have seen every other fly in every other angler's box, just by being slightly different. And it's a simple thing, but it does, it does work wonders oftentimes, particularly on, as I say, waters where there's a lot of angler traffic, and with catch and release allowing fish to kind of have those repeated exposures to different approaches, different techniques. So I think that's what I'd say about being thoughtful. Try and be a little bit different, and try and develop your fundamentals so that you can then have the freedom to think about hybridizing your tactics.
Wonderful advice. Absolutely wonderful. You touched on music there. So we're going to spin this round. We have on the podcast the Fly Culture playlist on Spotify. Going to give me a tune.
Oh, goodness me. Put me on the spot. Do you know what? I've recently been listening to a youngish creator called Ren Gill, and he released an independent album. So long story short, he had a lot of health problems, and he was dropped by a record label after finally sort of being able to be signed by them. Because of his health, he wasn't able to pursue that, and then he's basically just continued as a completely independent artist. But he released an album around Christmas time, and it actually went to number one because he's got such a massive following on social media. So pretty much anything from the Sick Boy album is worth a listen. It's interesting because he does quite a lot of quite sort of depressing and quite thought-provoking stuff on guitar, and he's a very good storyteller, and that's his background is in busking. But this album that he did is very much hip hop, so people can sort of pick and choose what they like between that. But if you've not seen him, go and have a look at Money Game Part 3, which is the video for that is very important to watch because it's just a piece of stunning art. Basically, it's like nothing you've seen before.
Nice, that's wonderful choice. I will go and look that up in 2 seconds as well. I'll do a shout out for our designer John Ogborn's son Jack, who sometimes helped me with the mixing of this podcast when it doesn't all go to plan. He has a project called Bingo Fury, and he's taking to the road, so I hope that you'll have a look at his stuff as well. And again, very artistic, great, interesting music as well. So thank you for that, Paul. I've learned so much today. How, if people need to get hold of you, if they need to contact you, if they want to find out what you're up to, learn about all the books that you've written as well, and I'll guarantee even old dogs like me have taken so much from Paul's books as well that I've really, really enjoyed them. So I hope you'll give those a look at. But how can people find them, Paul?
Well, I'll pop you some links, obviously, to put around the podcast. But obviously, I have an author page on Amazon. So most of my books, all of my books are available on Amazon, and that can be, if people are from overseas, that's the best way, most reliable way to get them sent to you. So yeah, there's I think the 7 print books on there at the moment. I'll send a link to my author page for listeners. There's also my website, fishingdiscoveries.com, and on there I will put a sign-up page for the River Perspectives, and that's my premium email subscription, the up-to-date live as they happen experiments and ideas. And so, yeah, that'll be the new perspectives, river fly fishing, I think will be the full title for that. But I'll certainly provide a link to that. Beyond that, I have a Fishing Discoveries YouTube channel, and that takes in quite a few different fishing styles. So if you're looking to expand, there's plenty of Euro nymphing and stuff like that on there, but there's wet fly, but also things like BFS and some of those funky, sort of slightly esoteric methods as well. So that would be the main ways, really. The Fishing Discoveries YouTube channel, fishingdiscoveries.com, and the author page is on Amazon.
Thanks so much, Paul. So if folks want to learn a whole lot more, you know exactly where to go look. Paul, as ever, it has been wonderful to chat with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've taken so much from our conversation today. Thank you so much for coming along back on the Fly Culture podcast today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Pete. Thank you for having me.
Well, everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this. There is so much information that I hope you have taken from this that helps set the tone for the coming season. And perhaps you picked up some tips that you're going to put into use. I know I certainly have. So again, thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly published magazine owned and run by fly anglers. When it comes to fly fishing, we've got you covered.